Well, I hope you like pictures of prairie fire flowers because here we go again. Last week there was uh, the same type of flower in actually kind of the same location. This is another prairie fire flower in my neighbor's field, shot as I'm looking towards the west. So the flower is backlit, and this is taken later in the day, probably, I don't know, 6:30, 7 o'clock, I'm not sure. And even some other elements like the little hairs on the flower that are sticking out from the stalk. There's a lot going on in this flower, in this photo of this flower. But unlike last week's composition, which was a lot more simple in nature, last week's was just really basic, like one flower right in the middle and nothing really on the sides to compete with it in the frame and some nice background elements. This has a lot more going on. And this is almost like a version 2.0. Not that the other one is a bad one. It's just I shot the last week's photo and then I thought, well, what else can I do with that, with this idea of a prairie fire flower? And I've taken a lot of these pictures over the years. I always like doing it because the colors are so cool. And I thought, well, what's another way I can take an interesting looking picture of that flower? And I ended up coming across this composition that you see here, this flower, and then made this composition. And I like it because there's like a density to the frame that I appreciate. And I'm not saying like a great photo has to be jammed full of stuff, like Rick McCallum describing Star Wars Episode 1. I'm saying that sometimes it helps to add some other things to add more texture and liveliness to an image, and that's what's going on here. I've got the subject, obviously, which is prairie fire flower, and then I've got some interesting foreground elements, like this. It looks like a cloud or some cotton balls, these onion flowers directly in front of it in the foreground. And then on the left-hand side, you see more of these white flowers receding into the back, and you see one on the right-hand side too. And then way back, you see the blown out balls of light, the bokeh balls of light poking through the trees way in the back. There's just so much interesting elements of this photo, especially compared to last week's. And they're both good. So I don't want to compare and be like, well, that one was terrible and this one's much better. They're both good in their own ways, but last week's taught me a few things that I learned when I shot this one. I did take this at f4, and I think that was probably a mistake. I probably should have dialed the aperture down a little bit, stopped down, I forget, used a smaller aperture, like maybe 5.6 or even f8, because I think it still would have maintained all of the, or most of the foreground background blur. I think that you'd still have the very clearly defined subject, except it'd be a little more in focus. There's enough of this flower that's out of focus that I kind of wish I could redo it with a smaller aperture to get a little wider depth of field, but that's fine. It's great as it is, in my opinion, and who knows, maybe I'll use this to take more pictures of similar flowers in the future.